Good afternoon. This is Sandy Tafour. I am the Client Services Manager for Possible Now. And today, Compliance Point and Possible Now are happy to bring you our 4th annual Compliance Review and Forecast. One of the many educational sessions we will provide throughout this year, this webinar is always one of our most popular. And I can see from our registration list that today's session is no exception, and we thank you very much for being with us. The goal for today's call is to discuss the legislative changes that took place in 2011 relative to direct-to-consumer marketing and privacy, and to look at potential changes in 2012. We have 3 speakers today. From Compliance Point, we have Ken Sponsler and Matt Cagle. For those that are unfamiliar with Compliance Point, they specialize in global privacy legislation that governs direct-to-consumer marketing. Compliance Point works with some of the world's largest marketers, helping them understand the legislative rules, build compliance processes for their marketing programs, and monitor and enforce compliance throughout the enterprise. The Compliance Point team has performed dozens of compliance assessments, safe harbor reviews, audits, and third-party compliance certifications. All of the Compliance Point consultants are CIPP certified through the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Members of the staff are also certified as ATA self-regulatory organization auditors. Compliance Point has a firm grounding in the operational, technical, and educational aspects of compliance. And we also have a special guest sharing her expertise with us this year. Michelle Schuster is a partner with the law firm McMurray, Peterson & Schuster. She's a former Ohio AG Consumer Protection Chief and has established a solid record of assisting her clients in compliance with privacy, telemarketing, and consumer laws. Michelle is the author of the American Teleservices Association Regulatory Guide and currently serves on the boards of both the ATA's Ohio Valley chapter and the University of Akron Taylor Institute for Direct Marketing. So we're glad to have Michelle with us as well. At the end of the session today, we will have a phone-based Q&A. The operator will provide instructions when we get to that point. So now we're ready to turn it over to Ken Sponsler, the VP and GM of Compliance Point. Ken?
Thank you, Sandy. And thanks, most of all, everybody attending today. We looked at the list of attendees, and there's a lot of compliance people there, marketing people. But we also noticed a lot of friends and a lot of clients and a lot of people that we have spent time in person with and time on the phone and time through email back and forth and helping with compliance. So it sure is great to see our audience today are mostly made up of friends. We're also very honored to have Michelle join us. She's been a partner of ours for quite a while, and we've learned to trust her judgment and her experience in these matters as well, so we're happy to have her. We've got a lot of material to cover. I want to get right into it. Today's agenda, basically, we've already had pretty much about us. We're going to go through the regulatory guide for 2011, the update that Sandy mentioned, talk a little bit about some of the enforcement actions and lessons learned. We'll briefly cover some things in Canada because, believe it or not, there's some things that are going on in Canada that could impact you whether or not you market directly in Canada. So we want to let you know about those things. Also a little bit, very briefly, about global marketing updates. We're not going to spend very much time there. And then the forecast and a Q&A, as Sandy said. Sandy already talked a lot about what's on this slide. Really the only thing that I want to add to that is we have added to Compliance Point a huge capability in our information security compliance practice. I just wanted to make sure you knew about that we can be a resource for you for PCI compliance as well as network vulnerability, security, HIPAA compliance, network penetration, things like that. We have a very robust staff that are experts in that. And so if you have any needs like that, we can be a resource for you as well. And then finally, we have, and for many of you we see today, our career college folks on the line today. We have also been involved in admissions compliance evaluation programs for admissions, as well as first and third party employment placement verification services. So we do those services as well as audit your placement verification activities. Michelle, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about your firm at this time.
Sure. Thanks, Ken. Hello, everybody, and thanks for attending today. Just real briefly about our law firm. We're located in New Albany, Ohio. All of the partners within McMurray Peterson Schuster were former regulators, having been chiefs of Ohio's Consumer Protection Section. Also, former Attorney General Betty Montgomery is with our law firm. And we focus almost exclusively on any issues that affect businesses that sell directly to consumers and the mediums that they use in doing that. So most of our clients come to us because they're seeking guidance or have had issues in the areas of telemarketing, privacy, social media marketing, text messaging marketing, those types of things. Unfortunately, a part of our practice also focuses on defending companies that have been pursued by regulators, mostly attorneys general or the Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Communications Commission. So with that, Ken, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, let's jump right in. We're going to talk a little bit here about the 2011 regulatory updates, and there have been several significant changes in the laws at both federal and state level. And, we're not going to be able to cover them all, but what we did was we analyzed what was out there, and we wanted to bring up the things that we think are most significant. So there has been a very busy year this year with lots of emerging issues, and some of these could have significant impacts down the road. So let's jump right in here on the 2011 updates at the federal level. The Federal Trade Commission published two reports recently. One is the data book, and they publish this every year. And this is their mandate to Congress that they will monitor the complaints that consumers have, as well as how well the National Registry is working. And so in these two reports, there's some interesting information here. The FTC reported there were now over 210 million phone numbers on the National Registry. This was an increase of about 8 million from last year. And by the way, we're talking fiscal years here, so this was September through October. Interestingly, and many of you may not realize, but Possible Now was selected from among many vendors to actually perform hygiene on the list, on the national list. So they perform a service on a regular basis that removes numbers that were once assigned to the party that originally put it on the list, and then we find out that through their algorithm that same party no longer owns the number, and so they remove that number from the list. And this was a promise that the FTC made in 2009 when the list became permanent, that they would perform this hygiene. And the reason I bring this up is Possible Now downloads the national list regularly, as you can imagine, and yesterday's download only had 202 million numbers on it. And so the FTC reported 210 million back in October. So we believe that difference is the hygiene process that is going on, which it looks like it removed about a little over 8 million numbers that didn't belong to the original parties. Another interesting thing here is the number of complaints. An increase from 1.6 million to 2.3 million basically in 2011. And I can promise you on this phone call today, many of your companies are among these 2.3 million complaints. I mean, if you make outbound calls, it doesn't matter what kind it is, you're going to have complaints because people complain without ever even picking up the phone to find out what you want. So you're probably on there somewhere. A number of companies are paying subscriptions now, but, look at this trend here. In 2006, there were 6,800 companies paying for the access to the registry, and in 2011, that dropped to less than half in 5 years. So that is an amazing statistic. And it says probably a couple of things. There are less companies telemarketing, or more companies are only doing exempt telemarketing. And as many of you know, if you're only doing exempt telemarketing, you can access the National Registry for free of charge, and this enables you to access and comply with the more restrictive state do not call lists. So if anyone has any more questions about that or how that works, or if you think you qualify for that, just make sure you get a hold of us and we'll explain the details of how that works. Moving on to the next slide here, we're talking about the fee increase this year. The fees have been static since 2009, so there was a modest increase this year. Believe me, when Matt talks about the cost of the Canadian list, you'll see that you're getting a pretty good deal, even with the increase here from $15,503 to $15,058 a year. You still get the first 5 area codes free, so not a lot has changed there. Let's move on now to the Federal Communications Commission rules. This is an interesting one. They have adopted the Truth in Caller ID Act, and I want to make sure that everyone understands the implications of this new act, because this act really didn't change anything that's currently required in the telemarketing sales rule under the FTC or the FCC's Telephone Consumer Protection Act. Both of those rules require that everyone display caller ID. The number you display, if the person called it back, has to be answered and capable of accepting a do not call request during normal business hours, or of course you can use an IVR system. Both rules also require that you display a name, and both rules say that you can either display the seller's name or the name of the telemarketer or service bureau company that's calling on your behalf. It says that you must display the name if your telephone service provider has the capacity or the capability to do so. And all the time we run into companies who have some internal technology issue which is preventing them from displaying the name, and I can tell you that that is not a valid reason to not display the name. So I wanted to mention that because those two elements of the caller ID requirement are in both the TCP and TSR. Now here comes along the Truth in Caller ID Act. And really all this act is doing is not changing anything in the TSR or the TCP. What it's doing is adding a layer of responsibility here. The key factor of this act is malicious intent when you manipulate or spoof caller ID. And so what it basically says is that no person or entity in the United States with intent to defraud shall harm or wrongfully obtain anything of value, knowingly cause, directly or indirectly, any caller ID service to transmit or display misleading or inaccurate caller identification information. The key factor here is intent to harm. And so one of the questions that I had is I know there's a lot of entities out there that specialize and provide services where they're spoofing the caller ID number so that when the phone rings from a call being placed in New Jersey, the phone rings in California, there's a local caller ID number so it looks like somebody in town is calling. But this was specifically mentioned, and the FCC, if you look at the report in order on paragraph 24 and 25, this is where several of the companies that provide call management services and debt collectors wanted to know whether or not they could have an exemption to display a local number on caller ID. And the FCC declined and basically says that, you know, the legislative history of the Act makes clear that manipulation or alteration of caller ID information done without the requisite harmful intent does not violate the Act. So the bottom line is these services appear to be okay as long as the intent is not malicious or an intent to mislead or defraud, But remember what I said earlier about the TSR and TCPA. You must display either the name of the seller or the name of the Service Bureau. And so doing things like displaying Red Cross or, Humane Society or something like that that's false, you would be in violation of the TSR and TCPA. Next, the FCTC urges the FCC to find sellers liable for calls made outside sellers. Now, we don't know how this is going to come out yet, but if you've been following this, you know that the FCC published a public notice seeking comment on two questions. And basically, the first question was, under the TCPA, does a call placed by an entity that markets the seller's goods or services qualify as a call made on behalf of and initiated by the seller, even if the seller does not make the call? The second question was, what would determine whether a telemarketing call is made on behalf of a seller, thus triggering liability under the TCPA? And of course, we all know the Federal Trade Commission has been very active. We have seen a lot of things in the news, and particularly problematic have been home alarm companies and satellite companies, cable companies, other industries that have a distributor or dealer network. There's this ongoing argument where the sellers are saying that we have no control over these independent businesses. They're running their own businesses. They have varied methods of doing so. And we just don't have control over that. It's unreasonable for us to try to control it, and the Federal Trade Commission has disagreed. So what does this mean? Depending on the crafting of this language, if a seller is going to be responsible for a third party's calls, imagine if you're relying on lead generation, for example, you're in the mortgage industry, you're in the insurance industry, or you're in the career college industry. We all know that many lead aggregators are in the practice of calling to pre-qualify leads to make sure they meet your requirements. They may be trying to push them to you, one of their clients. Could calls like that, depending on how this is worded, could those types of calls be deemed as calls that you're responsible for, even though you didn't initiate those calls yourself? So this is something we need to watch very closely as this is released, and certainly offer your comments and concerns about this potential problematic rule. Next is the Mobile Information Call Act, H.R. 3035. If you were following this, there were bipartisan support for this rule, and basically what it was we had business leaders who wanted to be able to call their customers for informational reasons only about, services. Your product's been shipped, your payment has been received, reminders of appointments, things like that. So there was going to be no solicitation, and it had to have an EBR in order to make these calls. So they wanted an exemption carve-out from the prohibition of calling wireless phones with an automated telephone dialing system. And this was overwhelmingly unpopular. It was so unpopular, 48 attorneys general across the states sent letters of opposition. Every consumer group out there was jumping up and down about this, and so Congress killed the bill. And I can tell you, and I hope all of you realize, that this is a very telling turn of events. If something like this is so unpopular, along with the fact that cell phone use and families with only cell phones has taken off, immensely here, it is a telling of the future because of this. Let's look now at an interesting one here that's been proposed. It is the U.S. Call Center Worker and Consumer Protection Act, H.R. 3596. It also has bipartisan support. It was introduced and co-sponsored by Tim Bishop from New York and Representative McKinley from West Virginia. There is also an additional companion bill in the Senate, which is very similar to this one. It's Senate Bill 1536. And it's called the Notification of Origin of Telecommunications and Internet Consumer Exchange Act. What are the purposes of these acts? It's interesting. It would require a business entity that either initiates or receives a customer service communication. So this is your inbound operation as well. It would require each of the employees or agents participating to disclose their physical location at the beginning of each communication. So if they're overseas in India or in the Philippines or anywhere else, they would have to start out by telling people that call in where they are located. And you can see all the bullets there, the other requirements under the 3596 version of this bill. You know, the prospects of this issue moving forward, you know, it could be possible as this issue is constituent friendly with bipartisan support. And, of course, having companion bills in the Senate, you know, this is something that could actually happen. And so it could have overwhelming implications for a lot of businesses that rely on overseas resources for this. The next issue that we want to discuss is the FTC chairman issuing of the Commission's 2011 annual report. And this is largely driven by privacy concerns and the fact that you've heard it stated time and time again that consumer privacy expectations are not being met by marketers. And so the FTC released a staff report on privacy issues based on more than 40 years of enforcing the privacy law, and they therefore proposed a framework to balance consumer privacy with the industry innovation in the 21st century. So they came up with these privacy by design, simplify consumer choice, and do not track. I can tell you a lot of this is driven by global compliancy influences where e-commerce has no border, but sovereign nations certainly do have borders. And so the U.S. is under increasing pressure to step up our privacy laws and enforcements. And this is just an example already. We've seen where the FTC has settled with Google and Facebook and included privacy by design requirements in the settlement terms. So you're going to see more of this. The Google case really was a safe harbor, Department of Commerce safe harbor issue where they, as you know, if you agree to abide by safe harbor provisions for data transfer, if you're not abiding by what you agree to, then you could be subject to these kinds of actions. So we're already seeing this privacy by design as part of settlement actions. The other one is the do not track legislation that is being proposed, two bills, Senate Bill 913 and the House version 654, basically giving people the choice of knowing what data is being tracked, how movements are being tracked, what is being done with the data. The little icon you see on this page was proposed by the Interactive Advertising Bureau, which is made up of heavyweights like Google, Microsoft, and Facebook. They are trying to have some self-regulatory initiatives by having an icon like this on web pages of members where consumers can click on that icon and then indicate their tracking preferences on that web page. So look for this to continue to be an issue in the future. The FTC also proposed COPA amendments. This really is just an attempt to update COPA, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, to really catch up with technology, clarify parental notice requirements, and add a few methods of obtaining verifiable consent. So look for this. It probably will pass this in 2012. Real quickly, some of the federal actions, we just pulled a few of these in the interest of time, and we pulled these because they all tell a story. The first one was the telemarketing firm that settled for $500,000. This one is false caller ID, putting out things that simply were not any indication of who the company was. And believe me, the FTC, when they see anything on a complaint that talks about an incorrect caller ID, that's going to rise to the top. The next one is...
Can I interrupt you just for 1 second? Because it's probably worth noting here that the FTC has put together a special unit that is focused solely on caller ID issues. So This is particularly telling in that I think we're going to see a lot more actions in this area.
Thanks, Michelle. The next one's a scooter company, and they paid $100,000. And what gets them in trouble is what we see all the time. They thought it was a brilliant idea to have a sweepstakes. And so if you signed up for the sweepstakes, you could win a free scooter, and we need your phone number so we can call you when you win your free scooter. And so what they did was took all those phone numbers, assumed an EBR, and paid $100,000. I don't know how many scooters they sold, but they donated $100,000 to the U.S. Treasury. If you're doing sweepstakes, you really got to be careful what you're doing. There's a lot of commentary out there about sweepstakes use for EBRs, and the FTC takes a dim view of it, as well as states. The next one was a message spammer. He didn't do too bad. He was putting out 85 texts per minute, every minute of the day, 365 days a year. Unsolicited commercial text. So this reads to me like somebody who thought they were going to spend as much time as they could to get as much out there as they could, and then sell everything and spend everything they had in the bank or go to jail. So, I mean, it makes absolutely no sense that we still have people out there that do these kinds of things despite everything that's out there that is available to companies to comply. The last one was really a commercial company providing robocall service. They, again, were masking caller ID. They were not displaying caller ID as they should, and they were just calling people on the do not call list. Real quickly here, as I know I'm going over my time, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit held that courts have federal question jurisdiction over private rights of action. Michelle's going to talk more about this later. We also have a U.S. District Court in California. They come up with some really good ones once in a while. This one held that CAN spam does apply to social media messaging. And this was the Facebook and Max Bounty case. So pay attention to that one because, you know, we have seen many times where we've heard courts say that the intention of the laws, even though they're not explicit in their language, the intention of the law is being used in a broader scope to apply in many different situations. And then the last one, a class action suit was allowed to go forward against a debt collector. This was a case where a husband gave his wife's cell phone number when he applied for a loan, and so they called the wife to collect the debt. She says, well, I don't have a debt, and I never gave you my number, and the court decides to let the class action move forward. So what does that tell you? You got to think about strengthening your language when you collect phone numbers, particularly cell numbers. You got to tell people to warrant that they're providing their number or they're providing a number that they have authority to provide. When you have cases like this come up, you have to take extraordinary measures to protect yourself. I am running late. I want to turn it over to Michelle to handle the state regulatory updates. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Ken. You know, before we get started with the specifics of the state updates, I think it's probably worthwhile sharing a little bit of insight on what I've learned from having been a regulator and also having been on the other side now defending companies. Probably the most frequent question I get from companies that have come under the scrutiny of a regulator is, why me? What is it that I did that caused attention that my competitor who's doing far worse things did not get the attention brought on them? So I think it's worthwhile understanding how the Attorney General's offices in particular or the other consumer agencies that are enforcing their telemarketing regulations function. I think it's important to understand that all of these AG offices function within a larger group called NAG, which is the world's greatest acronym, National Association of Attorneys General. They have a pretty close affiliation within NAG, so much so that they get together twice a year with all the consumer protection chiefs who sit in conference for anywhere from 2 to 4 days discussing what the hot topics are in their state. And they have subgroups, subcommittees within this NAG structure that focus on specific areas. And there is a subgroup that is targeted solely towards telemarketing, and several hours during that multi-day conference are spent talking about telemarketing issues that these AG's offices are seeing. So These AGs they talk about what companies are getting the largest complaints within their state. They talk about what types of actions are causing the most trouble for their states, and they decide collectively if they are going to start targeting a specific area, sometimes a specific company where they'll act in concert and sweeps, sometimes working together in a single litigation in what we call a multi-state action. And it's important that you understand those things. So what's going to get you on an AG's radar screen and cause you potential trouble in the future? The number one reason that a company runs into trouble with a regulator is because of the consumer complaints that they receive. And as Ken very aptly pointed out, it doesn't matter if you are actually violating the law. It matters that there is a perception that you're violating the law as a result of a consumer complaint. In some of the cases that I'm going to talk about here in just a minute, you'll notice that there were as few as a couple dozen complaints or 60 complaints against the company. That was enough to trigger regulatory attention for an AG because they feel, right or wrong, they feel that if one consumer has complained, there are hundreds out there that have not complained. So while we may say we made millions of calls last month and we only had, 60 complaints, they don't accept that as in any way minimizing their attention that they're going to bring upon you. So if I could give you any advice today, the most important thing that you can do is manage your consumer complaints. Have an effective system that identifies trends in consumer complaints to your company, to the BBB, to the AG, and be able to effectively identify those and take actions to try to eliminate those types of complaints. Number one most important thing you can do. You should also know that at these NAG meetings, the FTC is invited to attend and almost always does. The FTC, as Ken had talked about earlier, has the Sentinel, which is a complaint gathering database used by the FTC that consumers can file complaints online. The FTC brings with them for each state consumer protection chief a packet that contains a breakdown of the complaints that were received by the AG for companies located in their state or citizens located in their state. And they'll give you a nice little pie chart that breaks it down for you and lets you know which companies were involved. So manage your complaints. And by all means, if you do get a letter from a regulator saying that they've received complaints about you, do not set that aside. Answer that immediately. It needs to become your number one priority in order to prevent issues moving forward. Alrighty, so let's dive in now to what went on in the states in 2011. And these, again, are highlights, like Ken was saying, of what happened in 2011. We don't have enough time to go through it all, but these are the legislative actions that took place last year. And I'll have to tell you, I was really rooting for this first one in Florida. A bill was introduced that would have completely repealed Florida's Telemarketing Act, so it would have released all restrictions against telemarketers in Florida. I'm sure that no one on this call is surprised that that failed. But it's interesting in researching this bill, I was trying to figure out what it was that caused somebody to want to introduce this in hopes that maybe it would identify something for other states that we could use. But the only thing that I could find is that a staffer did some research and determined that if they repealed this, there would be 89,000 businesses that would save $127 a month, or $11.3 million in total. And it would only have had a significant effect on the company or on the state's revenues. So they were seeing this as a business-friendly piece of legislation that would have increased jobs and decreased expenses for businesses in Florida. Unfortunately, it died, and alas, we still have the Florida telemarketing regulations. Interesting in Florida, not on the slide, but something that was introduced in December is that Florida is currently considering removing the requirement for state telemarketing registration that you provide your agent's Social Security numbers. I think that needs to happen in every state. The use of Social Security numbers is not a good idea for this type of thing, so I would not be surprised if that did pass here relatively soon. In Illinois, a bill that's been carried over to this year's session would prohibit politicians from using robocalls. I think that this bill does not have much, if any, of a chance of passing because of the constitutional protections for political speech, but nonetheless, that's still pending in Illinois. Indiana was successful in passing a regulation that added cellular telephones to their prohibition and also allowed for telephone numbers with an out-of-state area code to be added to their do not call list, and hence gave the Indiana AG regulatory authority over companies that would be calling those telephone numbers. There is a requirement in the law, however, that says that the billing address must be an Indiana billing address, so it's not as broad as it first appeared when folks were reading that bill. Next, we have Oklahoma and Wisconsin. These are largely the same in that they are adding text messages to the definition of a telephone solicitation in those states. As I'm sure most of you are aware on the phone, currently the FCC's TCPA and the FTC's TSR both have been interpreted to include text messages as solicitations. So on a federal level, and probably for most of your compliance objectives, this does not change much for you. You will see, though, that there's a common trend in states with enforcement and legislation that is pulling cellular telephones into their definitions and what they're focusing on. And Ken and I are going to talk a little bit about that at the end of these presentations as we're talking about 2012 and ways to deal with this somewhat alarming issue. South Carolina has a bill that's pending. It's been carried over to 2012 that has to do with caller ID. Largely mirrors what Ken has already talked about on the federal level, maybe slightly more restrictive with the names that are required to be transmitted as far as the client name goes. Those are the high-level legislative actions that took place in 2011 and some that are pending in 2012. Now for the state actions. And you are going to see here a trend that is unmistakable and should send a very clear message to anybody who's operating in a telemarketing state that the states that took action in large measure started to take action because of a do-not-call violation. Do-not-call violations are so easy for regulators to identify. This was one of our easiest enforcement targets when I was in the AG's office because it is very easy for me as a regulator to take a look at my consumer complaints about consumers being called despite being on the do-not-call list, and then going to the do-not-call list, whether it's a state list or the national registry, if that's what the state's enforcing, and determine that that company is not scrubbing against the do-not-call list because they have not purchased it. So very important to manage do-not-call within your operations and make sure you have an effective system for doing that. The first one, that's the one thing I wanted to point out about trends. The other thing I wanted to point out is you should take this list and look at the states that are active in telemarketing enforcement and realize you probably have a heightened level of risk associated with calls into those states. Now, to me, that shouldn't matter too much because you should be complying in all states. But if you start having issues in these states, you should be aware that these regulators do not hesitate to pull the trigger to initiate some type of regulatory action. So pay close attention to what you're doing in these states. Wisconsin, notorious for taking action. Wisconsin is not one of those states that will always send a letter first. Indiana is one of those states that always sends a letter first, gives you an opportunity to explain yourself, and will generally give a warning. Wisconsin has been known to just pull the trigger with a lawsuit. They initiated an action in Wisconsin against a company by the name of First American Funding Company. They had made 3 million calls for the relevant time period and only had 60 complaints, yet Wisconsin went ahead and sued them, and the company was ultimately required to pay $144,000 in penalties. In Missouri, Missouri has a very active telemarketing unit, a staff solely dedicated to that. Our office has worked pretty closely with them because of a number of clients that we have in Missouri associated with a specific industry. But you'll notice that they took 2 actions that were of note here. The first one ended up in only a settlement of $10,000, but the settlement that took place in this first action against the Florida telemarketing was in the form of an assurance of voluntary compliance. I point this out only because I want people to understand that if a regulator starts pursuing you, there are things that are less severe than being sued and having to enter into a judgment. And one of those things is an assurance of voluntary compliance. It's a non-litigation form of settlement with an attorney general's office. The fortunate thing is there's no litigation involved. The unfortunate thing is that it's public, and generally the publicity surrounding lawsuits is worse than anything else. Missouri also settled with a New York telemarketing company. I'm sorry, I got those two confused. This is the one that was for $10,000. Both of these, though, initiated as a result of do-not-call violations, and Missouri is tracking that very closely. In Pennsylvania, we had a company that was engaged in a number of different things. The do-not-call issue was the gateway to enforcement, but ultimately they were entered into a consent judgment that also dealt with charitable issues, lack of disclosures, and marketing to children type issues. Let's move on to Texas. In the interest of time, because I am running even longer than Ken did, I just want to say that, again, you need to take a look at these: Texas, Mississippi, Florida, and Illinois. Very active in what they do. Illinois has been known to be the lead for the NAG telemarketing subcommittee, so very important that we pay attention to what's going on in those states. You can go ahead and take a look at what ultimately happened in those, but let's just move on to the lessons learned. Most importantly, do not call people that do not want to be called. It rarely leads to sales and frequently leads to regulatory trouble for you or having to answer complaints. As Ken mentioned, one of the cases here that's in this list had to do with lead generators, and it is so important that you do due diligence with the companies that you are conducting business with, your vendors, your lead generators, because if they have an issue, more than likely you will be held responsible for that issue as well. And finally, very, very importantly, respond to regulators. Never set a complaint aside to answer later. That needs to be answered now. Track your EBRs closely. Look out for surveys and sweepstakes. And always err on the side of being proactive in dealing with any of these types of regulatory complaint issues.
Thanks a lot, Michelle. That was a great update. Thank you very much. And we're going to now move on to Canada with Matt Cagle.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Michelle. Today we want to look at 3 significant regulatory changes that occurred in Canada in the past year, 2 related to telemarketing and do not call, and 1 regarding emails. The CRTC, which is the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, which is the enforcement body in Canada, worked to form an international do-not-call network to help facilitate enforcements against foreign entities, and we'll break that down in some more detail. Canada, they continue to develop their anti-spam legislation by drafting the regulations of Bill C-28. And just like we mention every year, the CRTC increased the fees for accessing the do-not-call registry, and I think you'll see this year it was a pretty substantial increase. Last October, the CRTC announced the creation of an international do-not-call network. Canada and Australia are going to chair the network, and other members include the United States, Mexico, Ireland, France, Hong Kong, Israel, New Zealand, Spain, Korea, and the United Kingdom. The ultimate goal is to facilitate cooperation between the various agencies that enforce telemarketing rules in their respective countries, and the network is also going to strive to harmonize telemarketing policies between the countries and to improve enforcement activities across the different jurisdictions. The members are going to meet annually to establish best practices and encourage the development of robust telemarketing laws around the globe. And we've already seen an example of this, actually. Canada came to an agreement with 2 telemarketers that were based out of Mexico who were selling and promoting vacation packages to Canadians. So the CRTC worked jointly with the Mexican Consumer Protection Agency, Profeco, to come to an agreement that the telemarketers would stop making unauthorized telemarketing calls to Canadians. And we believe it's important for our audience on the call today because previously Canada only enforced their rules against Canadian companies and Canadian telemarketers, and now it appears they are open to enforcements against foreign entities. Switching gears to email, we want to look a little more detail at Bill C-28, which again is Canada's anti-spam legislation. This was previously known as FISA, which we discussed in detail during last year's presentation. The regulations, as they're currently written, would apply to most types of electronic messages, including emails and text messages. And according to Industry Canada, the bill is intended to deter the most damaging and deceptive forms of spam, such as identity theft, phishing, and spyware. There are 3 agencies that are going to be responsible for enforcing CASEL, one of which is the CRTC, which also, again, has responsibility for enforcing the unsolicited telecommunications rules. We believe that the international partnerships that we just discussed actually might also prove significant with this legislation if the CRTC decides to extend their role as the enforcer towards the anti-spam legislation. So as we've mentioned, this bill and the anti-spam legislation in Canada has been around for a long time. As you can see, it's now reaching about 2 years, and it appears that final regulations are going to be released at the beginning of this year and implementation occurring in the middle of this year. There is a chance the regulations could be delayed a little bit longer because the government has received significant industry pushback about a few items, and they're conducting further consultations with some stakeholder groups. And we believe, depending on how those go, it might, again, delay it even further. So while we don't have the final regulations yet, we do want to look at what has been published in draft format to show you a few significant differences. The one that probably stands out the most is the requirement for consent. As currently written, CASEL is going to require prior consent to send a commercial message to a consumer. However, this can be implied through an established business relationship. We believe for the individuals on the call, this is going to have a significant impact. If you email to Canadian residents, you would have to identify those recipients in your email campaign that are located in Canada and comply with these consent requirements. There has been, as we mentioned, significant industry pushback, and there is a chance this consent requirement may change once we see the final regulations, but for now, you would be required, again, to have that prior consent before sending the email. A few other differences that we'll point out really quickly. The opt-out link that's included in the body of the message must be active for 60 days. That's double what we see in the U.S. of 30 days. And the one that probably stands out for most of you at the bottom is the penalties per violation is much more significant at $10 million. But we do believe that this is going to be saved for those that are egregious violators doing those things such as identity theft and phishing. Now, jumping back into the telemarketing space, for anyone on the call that is calling into Canada and you're required to suppress against Canada's Do Not Call list, there are a variety of subscription links that are available. We touch on this every year. They range from 1 month to 12 months. But this year, the thing we want to point out is the substantial increase in the fee for accessing all area codes for a single year. The cost increased by over $11,000, and it's now over $33,000 per year to subscribe to the entire list. We think that's pretty interesting because their list only contains about $10 million in the U.S. registry, or 10 million numbers, and the U.S. registry, as Ken mentioned, contains over 200 million phone numbers at this moment. So for any company that is generating non-exempt calls into Canada, you need to ensure you subscribe to and suppress against the list. If you're a telemarketer calling on behalf of your clients, you need to ensure that they subscribe to and suppress against the list as required. So those were the regulatory updates that we wanted to touch on briefly. Quickly, we'll run through a few enforcements. As we mentioned, Canada's list is growing. It's up to 10 million numbers, and as the list grows, so does the number of complaints. The CRTC is receiving about 11,000 complaints per month. They've now received almost 500,000 since the inception of their rules and the list. And while the complaints are rolling in, we've actually seen a significant decrease in the amount of enforcement activity. When you look at the chart on this slide, you'll see there was a significant drop-off from 2010 to 2011. We dropped from 24 monetary penalties all the way down to 5. We believe this drop is due to a shift in the enforcement patterns of the CRTC. We believe they're looking more for quality enforcements instead of a large quantity of enforcements. Previously, we saw a lot of enforcements in the $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 range at smaller companies. The most recent enforcements have been in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, including 2 last year that were $1.3 million and $500,000 respectively. There's 2 enforcements that we want to look at very quickly. Both of these relate to the delivery of pre-recorded messages without the consumer's prior express consent. What we want to point out is that enforcement amount, $275,000 for the first company. This company sent pre-recorded messages encouraging consumers to sign up for more minutes on their prepaid mobile phone. This resulted in the company making a quote-unquote voluntary donation to 2 colleges in Canada. The other enforcement, again, involved pre-recorded messages without prior consent. This was a gym sending messages regarding grand openings at new facilities. We believe the company thought the messages were allowed because they thought it was an informational campaign, because they weren't specifically selling during the message. We believe the CRTC disagreed and viewed it as a program of solicitation because they were marketing the fitness center. The company ended up paying a $300,000 penalty, and as well as a few items that required a public apology in newspapers and on their website, as well as agreeing to facilitate a business education event. So as Michelle mentioned, it's not always the financial penalty. There is public relations damage that can result as well. So just to wrap up our discussion on Canada, we've seen that any violations of the rules can result in very significant financial penalties. While the level of enforcement is low, the amounts of the penalties is high. We do believe that companies calling from the U.S. are at more risk than ever before due to the creation of the International Do Not Call Network. And just like in the U.S., if you're calling utilizing pre-recorded messages, always ensure you have prior express consent if the messages are commercial in nature.
Thanks a lot, Matt. That was a great update for Canada. And we're actually going to skip over global this year. We got some comments that a lot of people are not global marketers, but if anybody out there needs any global compliance information, we have amassed a wealth of knowledge on global compliance. Any country that has regulations, we have those. We have translated a lot of those into English, and so we can be a resource if you have any global requirements for compliance. Let's now move into the legislative forecast for 2012, what's next, and I know we're running short of time here, but we'll quickly go through some of these. We first of all believe that the FTC is going to continue to focus this year on privacy issues. You're going to see more and more of the privacy by design and do not track, as well as the FTC taking having more enforcements in the privacy area, taking more actions. We remind you that the FTC commissioner, the chairman of the FTC rather, has stated publicly that we might move towards an opt-in situation here in this country. And so that's kind of scary to think about, but that's already on commission chairman's mind. We think the FCC will likely align their pre-recorded message rules with the FTC. And as you know, right now there's a big difference. If you have an EBR and you're not subject to the FTC, such as banking and insurance and others, you can still send a pre-recorded message to your customers under the TCPA. We just were notified that on February 15th, the FCC will announce that what they're going to do, basically. That there is a program that is called Open Meeting, which you'll be able to go to the web, type in FCC Open Meeting. On the 15th of February, there will be a live feed, and you will be able to hear the Commission's decisions on this robocall report and order. So that should be very interesting to most of you. What's next? The recent release of the Joint Privacy Safe Harbor Commission. You can see here all the agencies and commissions involved in this. The reason I wanted to talk about this, if you go to the online form builder there on the FTC's website, you can basically, it is a wizard that lets you put in your business and your privacy policies and your sharing policies, and it will build for you a privacy notice and privacy policy that meets all the regulatory requirements. So that's a good resource for you to go to. We also expect continued enforcements in pre-recorded message rules and misleading caller ID. I think Michelle and I both have hit very hard on those two issues as being front of mind of both federal and state regulators. We think that the laws are going to continue to evolve in the mobile universe because SMS, MSEM, GPS tracking, and web tracking technologies. We know of other technologies that leave a message on somebody's cell phone and never make their phone ring. So that's an emerging thing that's coming out. Count on the enforcers to be very diligent about enforcement of those new technologies as well. 400 bills out there in the states right now. Michelle knows these very well. They're pending. And so we could have additional complexity in 2012. We also think that the FCC is likely to adopt the FTC's recommendation concerning the responsibility for third-party telemarketing. Again, we reminded you to watch this closely and look at the specific language. And finally, this is a big one that we saved for last. The Supreme Court actually made a decision on whether or not there's federal jurisdiction to hear class action under the TCPA. And I'd like, Michelle, we've only got a couple of minutes, but I would like you to talk a little bit about the implications this could have for everybody on the call.
Sure. The reason that the Supreme Court got involved in this is because the Circuit Court had interpreted the language contained in the TCPA that says that actions can be brought in state court, or actions should be brought in a state court, and interpreted that as meaning that it can only exclusively be brought in a state court. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled that that is not accurate, that cases can be brought in state and federal court. So what does this mean for you? This means for you that you need to now be more concerned than ever about class actions. There has been just a huge growth of consumer class actions against companies in the telemarketing, text messaging, calls to cell phones, pre-recorded message area, and the federal courts are much more friendly to those types of consumer class actions. So companies are more easily sued and able to be sued in more jurisdictions. And just very quickly, an end note here for folks on this call, if I could give you one piece of advice heading into 2012, that is to manage your consumer preferences. And at every touch point with your consumers and with consumers that you have interaction with, please make sure that you get permission to contact them in the future in the ways that you would foresee contacting them in the future, be it by phone, cell phone, text message, pre-recorded message, whatever it is that you think is important, because you may have a limited opportunity to do that. Plan ahead. What Ken has been saying should be ringing true to everybody with that comment.
Thanks, Michelle. So we're going to wrap it up here with just one conclusion, and that conclusion is exactly what Michelle said. The time for permission marketing is upon us now. Oh. You can see the growing number on the national registry, the 13 state registries, wireless being very difficult to call anymore, increasing number of households are mobile only. In fact, in the world for people that between 18 and 30, 44% have wireless only. Nearly 50% of people that rent are wireless only. And so the only way you're going to be able to continue to be successful is to think about permission marketing. Preference management is certainly coming of age, and you can see there some of the quotes from the American Marketing Association believing that permission marketing is the only way we're going to survive. And Possible Now has a slogan about that. They say, just ask, because we believe that if you ask consumers how they want to be communicated to, then they'll tell you. And now we want to open it up for questions, and we're going to put up our contact slide here during these questions. If anybody is interested, we have a website here while you're getting your questions together about My Preferences, Possible Now Solution, and their expertise and knowledge and how to develop a preference center and preference management and offer preferences. So if you want to go out there and take a look at what they've developed and what they think about the subject, I think now would be a good time to do that.
Thank you, Ken. Keith, our operator, would you mind giving the instructions for asking questions at this time?
Certainly. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to ask a question, you may do so by pressing the star key followed by the digit 1. Star 1 for questions. We'll pause a moment to assemble the queue.
Hey, Ken, while we're pausing, if I just might fill a little bit of space here by saying that if you're interested in keeping up on what's happening on the state and federal level, I know the Compliance Point does a great job of getting updates out, and you'll obviously want to make sure you're signed up to receive their materials. If you go to my website, mpslawyers.com, you can also sign up for our newsletter. We've become very active with blogging, Twitter, notifications in real time as to what's happening out there, and I think it would be a value of those folks in this space.
We do have questions in the queue. We'll take our first question from Jason Niederkorn with TXU Energy.
Yes, I have two questions. The first one is in regards to HR Bill 3596. Can you give us an update as far as when you believe Congress will vote on that? And then the second question pertains to dialing cell phone numbers in terms of outbound telemarketing. You know, in terms of manually dialing them instead of using any sort of technology to launch the call. Where do you see cell phone dialing going in 2012?
In regards to H.R. 3596, it is in committee currently, and many times while these bills are in committee, they may be changed in some way, which would cause it to be, voted on again. And so we think that it has a good chance. It's not something that would be wildly unpopular, so I'm not sure of when it might pass, but I think we will hear something about this probably within 4 to 6 months. On the cell phone issue, what we said earlier about the attempt by business to lessen the standards a little bit was wildly unpopular. And so we think that the prohibitions that we see today are going to stay there. Currently today, you can dial a cell phone manually, not to be confused with using an automated telephone system in the preview mode. I'm talking about picking up a telephone and somebody putting their fingers on the numbers, manually dialing cell phones, but you still, even under that gets by the automated telephone dialing system prohibition. It does not overcome do not call. So you still need to make sure that cell phone number is not on the do not call list. And as you know, the problem with manual dialing is record keeping. How can you distinguish between a call you made for business and a call you made to order a pizza when you have to, put the records together to defend yourself? Next, any other questions?
We do have 2 more. We'll take our next question from Robert Trailer with Do Not Call Protection.
Yeah, hey, Ken.
Hey, sir.
Are you there?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had 2 questions. I've been doing some work with Tim on this, getting into this voicemail issue, auto dialing with voicemails through direct drop, and a product that Michelle's done some work with, Radius. And I was curious what your take was on express consents using either direct drop, and of course Radius is a different product, but direct drop or auto voice messaging in general for situations like for-profit education where their whole marketing base is about express consent, and of course it's okay for them to use SMS text. Any gut feeling on that?
Well, express consent is pretty clear and universal. You have to be, regardless of what it applies to, express consent to me implies a clear statement to the consumer as to what exactly they're consenting to. And we already see the differences. For example, under the TSR, when you gather express consent to send a pre-recorded solicitation message, that consent has to be explicit to receiving a pre-recorded solicitation message. So express consent is notice exactly what they're consenting to. It has to be evidenced by a signature. If you're gathering the consent on an inbound call or on a website, you have to have affirmation, some mechanism to indicate an affirmation of consent, such as a previously unchecked box. Michelle, is there anything else on that you would say?
You handled that beautifully.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
All right, sir.
And as a reminder to the audience, *1 for questions. *1, please. We'll go next to Faith Bear with MarketLink.
Hello.
Hi, Faith.
Hello.
Hi. Say, with regard to the opt-in, the opt-in, the bill regarding opt-in marketing approach, is there any lobbying, active lobbying going on to
Hello?
Is there any active lobbying going on regarding the bill, the opt-in marketing approach?
Well, that's not actually a bill. That is an opinion that was expressed by the chairman. So there is no bill right now to have opt-in. But I can tell you there are some very, very loud and boisterous consumer groups out there that would love to see an opt-in. Yeah. They would love to see inbound standards required, so that they don't have to wait so long and hold and go through an IVR tree and all of that. But right now there is no bill regarding opt-in.
Oh, okay. This is a major issue for we telemarketers. So.
Absolutely, and I hope I didn't mislead anybody about there being a bill. There is no bill. That is just an opinion shared by the FTC chairman.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Do we have any others, Keith?
We do. We have one final person in the queue.
Thank you.
We'll
close out after that. Thank you.
Okay. We'll take that from Steve Martin with TeleResources.
If you're making a business-to-business call to Canada, do you still have to buy the Canadian list?
No, the Canadian list applies to residential fax numbers and cell phone numbers.
Thank you.
And landlines.
Well, yeah, and landlines as well, but all residential numbers. Steve, I do want you to caution you, though, the unsolicited telecommunications rules in Canada do have additional requirements regarding business-to-business calls, but nothing required with the do not call list.
Thank you.
Okay, listen, thanks everybody for attending today. I'm sorry we went a little bit longer than we had anticipated, but we did have a wealth of information we wanted to get out there. We're going to send a survey out to everybody after this. If you would like to have another webinar focused on global issues, global compliance, or any specific global SMS text or emailing issues, we're happy to put that together for you. Just tell us yes or no. And again, thank you so much, Michelle Schuster, for taking time to join us today and making the webinar even more informed and informational.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, thanks everybody very much, and we hope to see you next year.
Have a great day.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's discussion. We appreciate your participation. And ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude today's discussion. We appreciate your participation.